The economic successes of the 1920s were brought about by three major factors: installment payments, the stock market, and credit. Installment payments are still in use today, where you pay a certain amount of money for something up front, then pay off the rest of the money in monthly or weekly installments over a predetermined amount of time. Credit was also a big factor of the Roaring Twenties. Credit allowed people to borrow money and pay it back in installment payments, just like it is today. However, the population back then seemingly forgot about the pay the money back clause, and so they saw it as free money, and then they used this free money to purchase property, cars, machines, stock, etc., with little thought going of how to pay this money back. So, following the Roaring Twenties, we arrive in the late 1920s, specifically 1929. On October 24th of 1929, the stock market rapidly began falling, leading to many people selling their shares, mostly at a loss. This quickly caused a chain reaction, accumulating on October 29th, when shares were a paltry fraction of what they once were. Simultaneously, and most likely as a result, many people lost confidence in the bank, leading these people to try to withdraw their deposits in the bank. However, as banks only keep a small amount of money on location, as they do lend out quite a significant portion of their money, and the fact that federal deposit insurance had not been established by this point, thousands of banks failed across the nation, and millions of people lost their entire life savings, and thus began the Great Depression. The president that had been elected in 1928 was Herbert Hoover, a mining engineer and a public figurehead, who was a big believer in the power of market forces. When the Depression hit in late October of 1929, Hoover was willing to help the American public, but did not want to extend that much aid, rather set up the public to where the public itself can pull itself out of the Depression instead of the government doing all the heavy lifting. However, this is not what the public wanted. Rather, in 1932, the American public decided they wanted more big government assistance in the form of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, abbreviated mostly from now on as FDR. Roosevelt was previously the Secretary of the Navy, taking after his old uncle Theodore Roosevelt, and had been governor of New York since 1928 until his election in 32. So, in 1933, FDR took office, and in one of his more popular campaign speeches, Roosevelt promised America a New Deal, and that is exactly what he gave the people. The New Deal was a series of legislation, public works projects, and fiscal reforms passed by the United States that assisted the country in recovering from the Great Depression. The New Deal included such vaunted legislation as the Social Security Act, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the National Industrial Recovery Act, the Indian Reorganization Act, and so many others. There were several sectors targeted by the New Deal for recovery from the Great Depression, some of which were bank stabilization and financial reform, social relief and welfare, establishing, expanding, and reorganizing public works programs, rural and farm assistance, and so many others. Each and every one of these fields needed federal government assistance to get back on their feet. For example, the Dust Bowl, a series of massive dust storms that raged across the United States in the 1930s, which was mostly caused by widespread soil erosion, ruined much of the American Midwest and destroyed much agricultural production. To combat this and the great surplus of agricultural produce in the North, the government passed the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which effectively paid farmers to leave their fields unused. This led to an increased demand for farm products as there was less products being produced, raising prices for farms and actually leading to more farm profit. Further, this legislation also combated the Dust Bowl as it allowed these fields to grow with natural flora and fauna that prevented the soil erosion that was causing the dust. Also, the government passed the Farm Credit Act to improve the federal funding to farmers, which did increase farm production and led to even more profit. From there, the government would continue to support farmers, but I have already mentioned the big legislation. As I have previously stated, thousands of banks failed upon the onset of the Great Depression, causing millions of people to lose their life savings. The utter insecurities and the lack of banking regulation would lead the government to pass such regulation as the Emergency Banking Relief Act, which only allowed banks that were evaluated as financially secure to reopen after the March of 1933 bank holiday. President Roosevelt followed this act up by stating in his fireside chats, which were radio broadcast directly from Roosevelt to the American public, that it was safer to put one's money in a reopened bank than it was to keep it under their mattresses. Following up the Emergency Banking Relief Act was the Glass-Steagall Banking Act, which not only created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, but also separated commercial and investment banking. This was a hugely important piece of legislation, and it seems to have prevented any fiscal crisis until its repeal, which was immediately followed by the 2008 financial crisis. Coincidence? Probably not. Anyway, after Glass-Steagall, the next series of reforms were the Securities Act and the Securities Exchange Act. These acts required that investors get fiscal information and other such relevant information concerning securities being offered for public sale, and to prohibit fraud in the securities industry. Another big piece of legislation related to banking was the Gold Reserve Act. This act ended the gold standard, which was necessary in the context of the Great Depression, and created a huge United States gold hoard at Fort Knox. Another great goal for the New Deal was relief and welfare. This series of legislation began with the Federal Emergency Relief Act, which created the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which would provide financial aid to states in order to support the local relief efforts within the state. This was followed by the Federal Surplus Commodities Corporation, which would attempt to distribute extra food and other commodities to those in need. An issue that arose was the funding for all of these projects that Roosevelt was passing, and the funding for these was secured by the Emergency Relief Appropriation Acts, which would end up funding all of Roosevelt's programs. The accumulation of the relief and welfare reforms was the Social Security Act, which I am sure you have heard of. The Social Security Act created a system of pensions, unemployment insurance, and aid to single mothers, all overseen by the Social Security Administration. Today, some claim that the Social Security Act has gone too far, seeing as we do use Social Security numbers to prove our own very identity when applying for jobs and other sorts of federal identification. However, that is not what we are talking about today, and as such, we shall move on. Probably the greatest goal of the New Deal was its public works programs, which are often abbreviated as PWPs. Some of the major legislation regarding the PWPs were the Civilian Conservation Corps, which put the unemployed and unskilled laborers to work on rural projects, as well as the Tennessee Valley Authority. It is a federally mandated company that operates a system of hydroelectric dams along the Tennessee Valley, and that company is still active to this very day. It is interesting to note that the whole idea of public works projects was actually first employed by President Hoover, which was how the Hoover Dam was built. However, the hesitancy of the Hoover administration meant that the idea was not fully developed under them. The Roosevelt administration took the idea and developed it, and made the system work much better than it ever did under Hoover. Moving on from the TVA, there are still many subsequent acts that had a massive effects, such as the Public Works Administration, the Civil Works Administration, and the resultant Works Progress Administration, which was basically the Franken program made up of all of those smaller public works programs. There are so many more public works programs that it would take all night for me to describe all of them, and so I hit all of the major highlights of these programs in this earlier segment. Let me quickly touch upon the Indian Reorganization Act and the Indian New Deal. The Indian Reorganization Act, also called the Wheeler-Howard Act, reduced federal control over Native American affairs and increased the autonomy of the reservations. This act has been referred to in recent history as the Indian New Deal, as it represented a major shift in American policy towards the Native Americans, whereas previously the natives had barely any sovereignty and were constantly pressured to adapt the American culture. The Indian Reorganization Act enabled the native populations to return to their historical ways. However, many Native American tribes opposed to this, as these tribes had grown to prefer the American way and did not want to abandon their current Western culture. And so, the Roosevelt administration would continue to assist America to recover from the drastic effects of the Great Depression. However, the New Deal alone could not end the Great Depression. Rather, it took an entire world war to return the economy to its pre-1929 state, which would end up putting America's economy back on the world stage, back in a strong, healthy state that put the 1928 economy to shame. Thank you for listening to me, and have a great night.